morning to you wherever you're joining us from. It is the 10th day of March, Thursday, 2022. Welcome to the newspaper review segment of our morning show, Good Morning Africa, coming to you live from our studios here, number 48 Swanika Street in Abelinkpe. Also streaming live on Facebook at www.facebook.com/panafricantelevision.com. We're also live across some 46 other African countries via satellite and, of course, some parts of Europe. These are the topics we'll be discussing for this morning's show. Before I introduce my guest shortly, African leaders talk to Putin over Ukraine crisis. That story was taken from the Daily Guide newspaper. Of course, the biggest story in Ghana is the fact that the Supreme Court has okayed the decision for deputy speakers to vote. So the story says deputy speakers can vote Supreme Court rules, and that story was taken from the Daily Guide, the Daily Graphic newspaper. CD depreciation, Nimue Thompson demands explanation of jailbreak from IGP. That story was taken from the Insight newspaper. And finally, disregard for party laws disturbing. Disregard for party laws disturbing. We took that story from the Ghanaian Times newspaper. So, without further ado, let me introduce my guest. I've been joined in the studio by Elikem Kotoko. He is a member of the NDC's communications team. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you.
Right. I also have with me here in the studios of Pan African Television the General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, as well as the Managing Editor of the Inside newspaper, Kwesi Pratt Jr. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
All right. So let me remind you that you can also join in the conversation. Our panelists are not the only ones who can comment on the issues. You also have the opportunity to do so, and by so doing, you can log on to Facebook, and we are streaming live at Pan African Television. Do want to send in your comments, and I'll try my best possible to read all of them for you. Let's get into our very first story. And African leaders talk to Putin over Ukraine crisis. I'll read a paragraph or two of the story as captured by the Daily Guide newspaper here. It says, Senegal's President Macky Sall, who is the current head of the African Union, has spoken to his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, to urge a lasting ceasefire in Ukraine. He is the second African leader to reveal that he has spoken to Mr. Putin. The other is Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. In a tweet, Mr. Sall said, as President of the African Union, I'm delighted about my talks this morning with President Putin to press for a lasting ceasefire. I commend him for listening and for his willingness to maintain dialogue for a negotiated outcome to the conflict. Mr. Sisi's office said his talks with Mr. Putin focused on the Ukraine crisis and on strengthening relations between the two nations. After Russian troops entered Ukraine on 24 February, the AU issued a statement calling for Ukraine's territorial integrity to be respected and for international law to be upheld. The West African regional bloc ECOWAS said it condemned the invasion. So this is the story as captured by the Daily Guide newspaper. I'll begin with Elikem Kotoko on this particular story.
Yeah, thank you so much, my brother, and good morning to our viewers once again. I think this Russian-Ukraine crisis has been one major albatross on the neck of the world at large, in the sense that there are rippling effects that affect every nation in one way or the other, because Russia remains a major oil-producing country. And Europe, for instance, actually benefits from over 40% of their gas. Many are those who have also jumped to some conclusions, either to just blame one side, out of either convenience or based on some alliance to one side or the other. But I think the major concern has been the fact that what are the major reasons why this whole conflict actually erupted. And I am not sure that we want to be apportioning blames now. I was smiling when I heard that Macky Sall was actually the one who placed the call to Vladimir Putin. Macky Sall himself also has questions to ask as a leader in Africa. But that notwithstanding, I think the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is just very disturbing. We know, as a matter of fact, that there cannot be any greater beneficiary than the weapons and arms industry that benefit more from this when conflicts of this nature arise, because there are manufacturers who are on standby and supplying and making huge sums of money out of this. But it is also an undeniable fact that reasons account for Putin's act, which may be considered justifiable to some extent, because probably any Russian leader in his capacity would do probably the same as he is doing today. Because if history has taught us that some decades ago, when Russia and Cuba were to form an alliance, and Cuba is 90 miles away from the United States, and the US was not ready to allow Cuba to form that alliance with Russia in order for Russia to build camp, because US felt that was a threat to their national security, then I think Russia would also not be feeling safe at all having the Ukraine join the EU or to join NATO, which ultimately means that America is just situated a nostril away from Russia. And these and many other concerns. I have read some other stories from other news portals. There are those who are making it look like Ukraine is doing very well. And to me, I would say giving them some false hope. Because to a large extent, giving them this false hope is even making it look as though there's some positive outcome from what they are doing. But they are really reeling. And I think that the world should come to a point where we find a proper way of calling for ceasefire than wanting to give one the hope through the media hypes or world leaders trying to speak certain words when we know that this is actually not even a Ukraine fight. This is more or less a fight for some of these countries that are spurring Vladimir Zelensky on to do what he and his people are also doing. I watched some news yesterday also where a whole camp has actually been abandoned by the military, the Ukrainian military. This maybe the Western media will not let us know. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a good call that the African leaders are also wading into this. The fact is that war has no beneficiary other than, like I stated, there are no positive sides to these, when especially we have come of age and believe that in all matters, diplomacy and tact, when employed effectively, can yield the expected results. It is also very known that Putin holds some very strong stance, which is making the conversations very difficult. But I think that the more we continue to approach it from that angle, eventually we may arrive at a solution than the war that is on our hands and what we're seeing. And at the mention of these, I think some world leaders or some other countries, I mean, do not have even the moral justification to wade in at all. And I will not hide from the fact to make mention of the United States, the UK, and all of that. We recall how Muammar al-Gaddafi was taken down when NATO forces moved into Libya. We recall Saddam Hussein, how we were told that they were manufacturing, he had weapons of mass destruction. President Bush later on came to tell us that we didn't find any nukes, they were misled. He's got blood on his hands, but they are all still walking free. So we don't need to look on for some of these things to keep happening. And the very people who have championed this with their invisible hands from behind continue to walk free. So there's a need for us to find a lasting solution to this. It's good. I think there's limited, what the African leaders can do is limited, but the fact is they have to also say something, because the impact does not exclude Africa at all. Fuel prices will continue to be on the rise. I read yesterday that Yara, for instance, have also told us that there will be fertilizer shortage globally, amongst other things, and this will be affecting our production, etc. So it's a major cause for worry for the African continent as well.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Let me come to Comrade Pratt.
Was engaged in conversations with the Russian leader, and that he was doing this as chair of the African Union, the question that I asked was, what African interests is he pursuing? Because in this situation, everybody, all countries, all continents are pursuing their distinct interests.
Yeah.
So if Africa is involved in talks over Ukraine and so on, what is it that Africa is talking to? What is it that Africa wants to get, out of this situation? Now, there are some analysts, especially in the West, who are saying that this war, this special military operation, or whatever it is called, is an attempt to recalibrate the world. If we agree that this is an attempt to recalibrate the world, what is this recalibration going to do to the world? Of course, we do know of the meeting of European leaders in Bonn, where they actually carved out Africa into spheres of their influence. That was a recalibration of the world. The transatlantic slave trade was a recalibration of the world. Classical colonialism led to a recalibration of the world, and today's neocolonialism is another recalibration of the world, and so on. So what is it that we are looking for? Now, I'm sitting here as an African, and I'm seeing all of these reports of racial abuse of Africans, and I cringe. Some of the stories are harrowing. There's an African woman, indeed a Nigerian woman, who is a student in Ukraine, who was made to walk 12 hours to safety. Because no bus, no train would take her, because the Ukrainian security was preventing her just on account of her color. As an African, I feel very, very sad that this is happening to us. There's another story told also by African students who were escaping from the war, and they were told simply that, look, the trains are not for Africans. And they were left behind. Now, if these are humanitarian efforts to take people to safety and so on, are Africans not human? Are Africans not humans? Would Russian bombs discriminate between Africans and non-Africans and so on? So this ought to be an important point of reference for African leaders who seek to intervene in this matter. How to protect Africans, how as Africans we can stand up, and feel proud of our color, of our culture, of our everything. That's an important dimension in all of this intervention by African states. Now, when we're talking about recalibration of the world, we have to look at our African reality. And our African reality is that Africa today has more than 50% of the total resources of Africa. And yet, look at the squalor, look at the poverty, look at the state of deprivation on the continent. What kind of new world can we build in which Africans will become masters of their own destiny? What kind of new world can we build in which Africans can begin to own their own resources and exploit their own resources for their own benefit? We are all talking about how petroleum prices are shooting up, and indeed petroleum prices have shot up significantly. They've moved from a low of less than $80 to about $145 today per barrel. That is going to have a devastating impact on Africa and indeed everywhere in the world. But why should that be? There are many countries in Africa who are major producers of oil. Nigeria, Angola, now Ghana is producing more than 100,000 barrels of crude a day and so on. How come that we have the capacity and the potential to produce so much oil, and yet cartels in the West decide what the price should be based on their fixations on war and so on? Can we recalibrate the world in such a way that we are insulated from the vagaries of the market, that we are insulated from the madness that goes on in Europe and so on. How can we insulate ourselves? That ought to be one of the major considerations of African leaders when they make such interventions. The other thing which is important for me is that today, you have a situation where so-called French-speaking African countries actually keep all of their foreign reserves in the French central bank. You have such a horrible situation in which African countries borrow their own money from France and pay interest on their own money. It's an untenable situation. So if you have such a crisis, and it shouldn't have been such a worldwide crisis anyway, but if you have such a crisis and we are making interventions, what interventions are we making in order for us to break free from this new type of slavery? You understand? These are my worries. Again, there is so much concern about the fact that the Ukrainian war has produced about 1 million refugees. And that is what is getting everybody crazy around the world. If you look at the statistics, over the last 10 years, the world has produced close to 90 million refugees. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on. These have produced close to 90 million refugees. What did the world do about it? What is the world doing about it? What is the world doing about it? Is it because those who are affected do not look like the Ukrainians? They have a different color from the Ukrainians? Is that the reason? So if we want to tackle the refugee problem, of course, we have to look at the refugee problem from a holistic view, standpoint. Syrian refugees are refugees. Iraqi refugees are refugees. You understand? Afghan refugees are refugees. This morning I was driving to the studio, I was told that the United States of America alone has committed $14 billion to its effort in Ukraine. $14 billion. How much did the U.S. commit to Somalia? How much did the U.S. commit to Somalia? Which was the direct result, the mayhem in Somalia was a direct result of U.S. intervention. How much did they commit to Somalia? You understand? How much did they commit to Syria? And so on. So these are all legitimate questions that we should bring on board. Now we appear to be so worried about what we call invasion of sovereign states. I want to believe that Iraq is a sovereign state. Was Iraq not invaded? I want to believe that Afghanistan is a sovereign state. Was it not invaded? I want to believe that Grenada is a sovereign state. What happened in Grenada? Well, does it not amount to an invasion and so on? So look, the double standards are killing. The double standards are killing. Bottom line, however, is that war is not in anybody's interest. And indeed, when there's an outbreak of war, those who suffer are not those whose actions lead to the war. All those who are responsible for the eastward expansion of NATO, which threatened Russia and which compelled the Russian government to take this action, are not suffering. They are not suffering at all. It's poor, ordinary, working-class Ukrainians who are suffering. You understand? So that is the reason why we ought to be opposed to war, because war has more devastating consequences for the working class, for the working people, and so on. And we need, therefore, to the extent that is possible, to stop the outbreak of war. And the call for a return to the negotiation table and an immediate ceasefire appears to be a legitimate and proper call that needs, our support. Now, if you look at what is unfolding also in Ukraine, one must be exceedingly worried. So far, the NATO countries and other Western allies are being conscious of the fact that this could lead to a thermonuclear war. And if a thermonuclear war should break out, there will be no survivors. Not in Europe, not in Africa, not in Asia, not in Australia. There will be simply no survivors in a thermonuclear war. So we are on the brink of what could lead to our extinction as human beings, not just as human beings. I mean, goats will perish, cows will perish, cats will perish, nobody will survive. Even maggots will not survive if there's a thermonuclear war. And that is why it is important for us to be rational. That is why it is important for us to take measures which would ensure that there is de-escalation. The Russians have said in very clear terms that the terms for a ceasefire are a halt to the eastward extension of NATO. The denazification of Ukraine and so on. They've laid their terms very clear. These terms appear to make some sense. You understand? Because if the eastward expansion of NATO continues, the Russian capital will be only 5 minutes away from an attack by NATO. No country will countenance that. No country in the world will countenance that. You understand? I mean, yesterday or 2 days ago, Russian nuclear bombers, strategic nuclear bombers, only two of them, landed in Caracas. Come and see the panic in the West. The panic in the West because two strategic nuclear bombers, I think they are called the white swans, swans or so, landed in Caracas. Look at the distance from Caracas to the United States of America and look at the panic it generated. And yet, NATO leaders want us to believe that they can build up their arms in Ukraine, who shares a border with Russia, and that should cause no alarm and so on. All of us deeply, very deeply regret the loss of innocent lives. All of us very deeply regret the loss of lives of children, women, vulnerable people, working class elements and so on. But everybody has a responsibility to work for the recalibration of the world, which will remove the burdensome privilege that so-called neo-colonial masters enjoy to our disadvantage. That is how we have to move forward.
Right, thank you very much. I'll say good morning to Elvis who was join us. Though he's pretty late, but I think there's still time for him to comment on the African story, the fact that African leaders have been talking to Putin over the Ukraine crisis.
Yes, good morning, and then sincere apologies to our cherished viewers. It's interesting, and on the one hand, and actually very quite worrying on the other. Clearly, the happenings of the Russia-Ukrainian war presents a new entrance into, an extraordinary uncertainty in respect of an undoubted creation of a new world order. And there's no argument about it. While the situation remains this fluid, regards must be given to the fact that it comes with enormous, international security implications. It redefines the happenings within the international political economy. It actually goes a long way to exert enormous pressure on the commodities, food, energy commodities in the world market. And so clearly, no continent exists in isolation from the effects, the perils of the happenings between Russia and Ukraine. And so on the basis of this, it could be underscored that should African leaders want to talk, they have the right and the space to do so. But in all of this, the fundamental question that should be addressed is, what is the particular place of Africa and its leadership in this new world order? What is our economic significance? What is our significance militarily and also within the security space? These are the parameters that defines the extent to which your voice would be heard. We have a situation where what is happening today redefines global oil shortages and prices. And consumers that are without fundamental reserves, as shockers to this, suffers it most, and that is Africa. So rather than talk to Putin in a voice that might not be heard at all, why wouldn't African leaders rechannel their energies and synergies to good governance? Why won't we channel our efforts to renegotiating the terms of our international engagements in terms of business and other such outlets? Ghana is an oil-producing economy. Nigeria is an oil-producing economy, at least in West Africa alone. However, who decides our fuel prices for us? What is our stake in our own resources, and how does it inure to our benefits? Today, fuel is 8.2 per liter, Ghana cedis per liter. That is bad. It doesn't matter who is in government. That is bad for any government. That is bad for any citizenry. That is not an appealing situation we should all smile about. And so, African leaders have a problem. I think African leaders are so much good at talk shop. The grammar is simply too much. The situation out there spells doom for us. In all of this, the AU has been very quiet, and sub-regional bodies such as the ECOWAS have been extremely quiet. Our presidents, African leaders, must bow down their heads in shame. What do they have to tell Putin? Which of us, under the rational choice module, will not do what Vladimir Putin is doing? Not to justify, the killings, but we are human. Who wouldn't do that? The first principle of life is self-preservation. The hypocrite in this whole matter, the devil in this whole matter, is the West, is the United States of America. In their quest to rise up to the stardom of hegemonic prowess, they have chosen to endanger the rest of the world and to, in the end, preside over nobody. That is the kind of a chaotic international economic and political order that the greed of America is causing the rest of the world. What has happened to the post-USSR, the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, led to certain agreements emanating from the Russia's plant of nuclear park in Cuba, which at the instance of Russia witnessed, that level of heightening of securitization of American safety, subject to which an agreement was held for the denuclearization of Russia's nuclear park in Cuba. America cited that Cuba was a neighbor, and so Russia's presence in Cuba will mean that Moscow is inviting Washington to war. Today, needless to talk of the, many advancements of America towards the East and to many Eastern European countries under the clouds of international law, now have chosen to jump into Ukraine when the tensions have been clear from the Crimea annexation in 2014 till date. What is America telling the rest of the world, to be in all fairness? that Russia doesn't have its own sovereignty to protect, that Russia should be quiet and wait to be undermined by America. What is happening today is a clear extension of the Cold War. It is a revitalization of the shadow arms of the Cold War. NATO, in my opinion, shouldn't be a relevant military force today. Why? After the end of the Cold War, Russia did the honorable thing in many of the treaty agreements with the United States, actually even deliberately collapsed the Warsaw Pact. What is NATO still doing in the international space? What is NATO still doing in the international space? Ably aided and led by America. In fact, NATO is America and America is NATO. Ukraine, Kiev is just 600 kilometers away from Moscow. Should Russia sit down and watch Ukraine attain full member status of NATO, allows NATO, which is of nuclear capability, to mount military surveillance and nuclear deterrence in Ukraine to the direct affront of the sovereignty of Russia. And the rest of the world thinks that Putin and Russia should sit down unconcerned when we know the history of the space race, the history of military prowess between Russia on the one hand leading the Eastern Bloc and America on the other hand leading the Western Bloc. I, as president of Russia, will do worse than Putin is doing. Look, it is better for all of us. In theories of nuclear securitization, there is this theory that says that more is better. Let us all wield nuclear power so that we can all be afraid that I strike, you strike, we all die. That way, we will all keep quiet and treat each other's threats with a pinch of salt. But when one nation wants to raise its shoulders and to say we are the masters of the universe, then you record the kind of situation we are recording now. Rather than talk to Putin, the rest of the world should be talking to America and NATO. Look, Russia is not mischievous on this matter. And I'm not sure Putin is enjoying the massacre of civilians. But he says that it is better for the civilians of Ukraine to die than for the civilians of Russia to die. Do you think that Ukraine will so much military prowess to be able to stand Russia? In fact, if Russia wants to end the entire Ukraine 1 hour from now, Russia have that nuclear capacity to be able to do so. There's no argument about it. There's no argument. But where does the gravitas of Ukraine come from? That in the midst of all this, the president and his country are not even looking as though they are softening their grounds. That is because there is a mightier hand giving them promises they feel are mightier, and that is America. I suspect that many of the military interventions, many of the military advancements, shall I say, are even NATO soldiers in Ukraine military uniforms. That is my sincere suspicion. So, who is the cause of this trouble? The happenings today is an opportunity for African leaders to talk, but not to Putin. They should talk to the rest of the world, especially the West, that, look, we also have a few oil-producing countries producing oil in quite significant margins. This is time for us to either break away from OPEC if OPEC would not listen to our own argument on how oil pricing must go, especially for oil-producing economies in Africa. This is the time for African leaders to do that. If African leaders are not doing so, they are simply being stupid. That is number one. Number two, there is a complete revisitation of what international law fronts upon when we talk about racism. Today, look at the many sufferings of Africans in Europe. Rescue missions are not addressed towards them. Evacuations happened, you know, without considering people of their black skin and origin. These are the things African leaders must take opportunity of to speak about and to make their stance very clear. I was disappointed when I saw scores of government delegations from the African continent, all countries in the African continent, running to wherever to go and sign a verbal of condemnation against Russia. The United Nations, in all of this, is also brought to question that is it really a formidable element critical enough for the reconstruction of peace and the guaranteeing of the safety of mankind? Let us think about it. Because now both the US and Russia have the veto power at the Security Council. What that simply means in common sense is that they can undermine the decision of the entire United Nations. So it tells us that it is not about money. Humility is required in the operations of the United Nations. By the way, since when have Ukraine become better than Libya? Since when? We saw the kangaroo antics. America and NATO forces, allied military forces used to murder Gaddafi in Libya. And today, Libya is what it is, and the West thinks what they have made of Libya today is a better democracy than it was under Gaddafi. My goodness, what is happening? Africa should reconsider going back to even the African traditional religion. Because I have a difficulty with Christianity now, that the man who brought me the Bible went and manufactured the guns and the nuclear weapons, uses them to his advantage, and tell me it is a sin to use them. My goodness, that's hypocrisy. And so it goes on and on and on. The West is telling us that Ukraine is better than Syria. We witness the happenings of, you know, the United Nations missions in Liberia, in the Liberian Civil War I and Civil War II. We witnessed all that. It did not attain such heights of securitization as we are witnessing in the case of Ukraine. What is special? What is happening now is simply a remarkable effort by Russia to stop the dollar system that have attained dominance in the international space over the years. That petrodollar politics is brought to an end by the geopolitical advantage of Russia. And so America thinks that a fast way to mitigate that danger is to take control of Ukraine. It is what the rest of the world will not take. And that is why, if you witness, a shortcut of this whole matter is what? The denazification of Ukraine, spearheaded by the West.
Right.
And so these are things the rest of the West and the rest of the world must consider if we want peace. If we do that, there will be peace. Otherwise, look at the alliance between China and Russia now. Russia have officially cut off all international protocols on the supply of crude to Europe and have channeled that to China. Even wheat, Russia have done same and have rechanneled the supply chain of wheat totally to China. You do not need a PhD in international affairs to understand that there is both diplomatic and military collaboration between Russia and China, and what that means for importing countries like Africa taking goods that are including toothpicks from China. And so clearly it is worrying also to the extent, and I'm concluding on this note, that it even empowers and builds the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, as a formidable global force. And we know what that means in the scheme of current happenings within the international domain. And so it brings to question foreign policy and security policy collaboration within the international space. And the monster globalization and international law have created to the detriment of the rest of the world. Right. This must be stopped, and African leaders must rise up to some thinking. African leaders must rise up to some sense. African leaders must stop being cowards, okay, and speakers of grammar, and rise on their feet and tell the rest of the world that we understand what this mercantilism means to us. I rest my case.
Thank you so much. I'll stay with you on our next topic, but before that, let me do a few Facebook messages. This one, it says, the war in Ukraine is getting more intense, and I expect the world leaders to hurriedly come together and get an antidote to it. That came from Suleiman Abdul Rahim. Thank you so much. JK says, live from Manchester, and I'm really enjoying the program. Thank you so much, JK. Del Abdallah says, everyone on this platform should listen to... Okay, not so clear. Krobias and Tekotoko Kufi says, good morning. The Supreme Court has spoken, and so shall it be. Right, thank you so much. Seth Abuchi says, you see the hypocrisy of the West. Now Ukraine is in a dilemma for its own stupidity. The Labdala says, African leaders are slaves to the West, and goes on to say that when they hear the name dollar, they all scramble. Adam Mustafa Hamid says, good morning to you and your panelists. Good morning, Adam Mustafa Hamid. On that note, let's get into our next topic. It is the biggest story in the country right now. The very fact that the Supreme Court has ruled that deputy speakers have a vote in Parliament, even when they are presiding in the absence of the substantive speaker. I'll stay with you on that particular topic.
Yes. Now we can have our bite on this. I think that with the greatest of respect to the Supreme Court and its ruling, unfortunately, shall I mention that the details of the ruling have not been filed at the registry yet, and the notice the Supreme Court served was the fact that the complete ruling will be served by Friday. And I would have wished to have had a full appreciation of it, or a considerable appreciation of it to its fullest extent, before delving into what might appear an intellectual legal analysis of a subject to which my opinion is built. Nonetheless, I saw this coming, and I don't think I have a problem with the ruling. The Supreme Court is the highest or the apex court with, constitutional jurisdiction, or shall I say original jurisdiction, for the interpretation of our Constitution and other statutes. Clearly, the ruling does make some sense and should also be seen as one that strikes a balance that ends a seeming conflict in the kind of parliament we have in the eighth parliament. Reason being that much as the ruling have invalidated and have defined certain provisions of the standing orders of parliament as being unconstitutional, much as that has been the convention over the period, it brings us two things. One, you cannot appreciate the provisions of Article 104 of the Constitution to its fullest extent without first of all having to make a comparative analysis of the letter and spirit of same to that of the provisions of Article 102 of the same Constitution. And so, where I get the direction of the court in their unanimous agreement and ruling is the fact that Article 102 specifies clearly that a person presiding, in other words, a person otherwise than the speaker himself presiding, when it comes to the nominal issues of formation of quorum, should not be counted as part of membership of the House. If we have that understanding, you advance to Article 104, and it is clear in its words, not using a person presiding, but using the specific term speaker. So it tells you that there is, in the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution, there is a legal distinction of intent between the capacity of speakership acting in original mandate as opposed to a situation where the seat is vacant, but for the purposes of administrative, running of the businesses of the day, should be occupied by a person otherwise than the speaker. And so the simple rules of interpretation, which I believe even a year one student of law will understand here, is the fact that the principle of expressio in law, in constitutional law, or in public law, come to play. And such maxim, which specifies that where it is not, expressly stated, then it is not forbidden. Then it raises to practical credibility the fact that any person otherwise than the speaker seated on the seat of speaker does not invalidate you or does not invalidate your membership and representational powers as a member of parliament. So the mere administrative occupation in ad hoc terms of the speaker's seat in order to advance the business of parliament in the absence of the persona of Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker himself should not de-alienate or should not neutralize the impact of that which is your original mandate, subject to which your constituents voted you to parliament. And so on the basis of this reasoning, I think that the literal, domain from which the ruling emanated speaks constitutional sense. Because for no fault of mine as MP, Mr. Speaker is not present. Yet, I am obliged to discharge parliamentary responsibility, one towards my constituents and two towards the Republic. So the duty of care I owe to the Republic is to act as a deputy in place of Mr. Speaker. But that is not to set aside my primary role on the floor of the House. And so it is understandable if any of the two speakers have the right to vote. And dispassionate of, political stance, it doesn't matter what advantage it might be. Let us also remember that to check the lapses of some of these things, the same constitution of the Republic of Ghana specifies that at no point in time should the two deputies be coming from the same side of the House. They should come from the varying political or partisan divisions of the House. So I think that the ruling is quite fair. We are hearing concerns by the minority on a few other issues that borders on the constitutionality of same and how its interplay with certain standing orders are. It tells us that there is a gray space in law left, and we must be interested that in the interest of democracy, we should move on. I think this ruling is significant to the extent that, there should always be, in the interest of the Republic, litigation must always have an end. And so the Justicia principle comes also to play in here. I think that we wait for the details of the ruling, we study it, and we can have in-depth, legal and intellectual discourse on same and see how it goes. But in the meantime, the decision of the Apex Court is highly respected, and we hope and believe that that will bring some sanity in the happenings in Parliament, not just because of the appropriation bills of the 2022 budget, but then, most importantly, going forward in future, we don't know what our democracy will become. And such conflicts, or even complex ones, will raise a convolution of issues that could undermine our multi-party system. And so this ruling is significant to that extent.
Right, thank you so much. Let me come to Elikem Kotoko. I think this morning, the former president actually made a Facebook post in that effect with regards to the ruling. He said, a unanimous 7-0, shocking but not surprising, an unfortunate interpretation of for convenience that sets a dangerous precedent of judicial interference in parliamentary procedure for the future. So he has expressed his shock over the decision. What is your take on this particular issue?
Yeah, I mean, no different from what the former president has actually put out there on his post. It is an undeniable fact that Parliament is, or the legislature, is expected to be autonomous or separate not to the dealings of any other institution. I listened to my brother with his submissions related to this. But you see, one major concern that has been put out there, which we all know from the standing orders, is the standing order 1101, which states of how Parliament can actually, let me read that. It says, order 1101 says, subject to the provisions of this Constitution, Parliament may, by standing orders, regulate its own procedure. And one question that I was even asking myself overnight was, okay, so we have a deputy speaker acting as speaker in that capacity. Would he partake in a debate, raise his hands and say, even though I am speaker, I have this position I need to say on this matter, and then say so, and then again take a decision on that? I think this is going to bring a lot of debates, and I will not hide from the fact that probably subsequent days will witness more physical altercations in our parliament if care is not taken because of this very ruling by the Supreme Court, which is considered by many as an interference in the parliamentary proceedings. I only pray that, I think I would even advise that they further seek review after everything is out, so that even in that review, as much as we would again not be surprised by whatever the outcome of that review will also be, it will bring finality to everything, so we know moving forward, this is the angle to take it from. If this is not reviewed, tomorrow or another time, someone else who, out of convenience for himself or herself or their regime or party, may also decide, okay, since the ruling was given, nobody sought a review of that to know what outcome the review or what verdict there will be for that review as well too. So when that is done also, then it brings an absolute finality to what the decision is on this particular matter, in order for us to be so sure that, yes. But I must say in all sincerity that it is becoming worrying for many Ghanaians to witness how the judiciary is perceived now to be somehow biased in their ruling. But one may jump to a conclusion to say, maybe you're saying so because of where you belong and all of that. But if you listen to other legal brains and the submissions they have made relative to this, it tells you that there are a lot of questions. And there's reasons why in matters of this nature, when we have people having to actually chair or lead such committees or lead parliament, for instance, you are expected to hold a certain position of neutrality. And once you want to say that because I was voted for, and for all intent and purposes, it implies that I must at all times vote, then you may have to even consider. One may also say, should we then say, if the speaker is vacant, or if the speaker's position is vacant, or if the speaker is absent, then should there not be any proceeding of the House until the speaker returns, in order to avoid a situation where a deputy speaker will be acting as speaker, but at the same time has full rights as a member of parliament to act in the capacity that we witness, which the Supreme Court has actually validated. So subsequent days, subsequent events will be very telling, and we look forward to all of that.
Thank you so much. Let me turn my attention to Mr. Pratt.
The decision of the Supreme Court. Absolutely scandalized by the decision of the Supreme Court. First and foremost, this is supposed to be a constitutional order which establishes the separation of powers. That simply means that the executive cannot dictate, to Parliament, especially when it comes to its rules and so on. And that also implies that the judiciary itself cannot be dictating the rules that are applied in Parliament. Now, so far, from what the court itself has said and so on, the main reason for the court's decision is that members of Parliament, when elected, ought to be able to represent their people all the time, and that they do that representation through voting. My goodness. I can't believe it. The committees of Parliament the chairpersons of the committees of parliament are also members of parliament. They have no original vote. They have no original vote. They only have casting votes. So what is the Supreme Court decision? What is this decision about? The chairpersons of the committees of parliament have no such votes. And that clearly shows that there's a reason for it. You understand? Now, you claim that deputy speakers must be able to vote on issues and so on. How are they going to do that? The deputy speaker is sitting in parliament, is presiding over parliament. There's a debate that he doesn't take part in. And the reason for him not taking part in the debate is so that he can maintain his neutrality. So when the question is put, when he himself puts the question, those in favor vote, and then he votes with the... it's so ridiculous. So absolutely ridiculous. You can't believe that this is a decision of the Supreme Court. And there are people who are saying, let's go for, like my brother, let's go for review. What review? What review? I can predict that the review will come to nothing. And that's the danger. I mean, when citizens come to the conclusion that the judiciary is predictable, for whatever reason, when we all come to a conclusion that as for these cases, if you take it to court, this will be the outcome, then the judiciary has failed. Completely failed. It will not be able to exert any impact. You know, and I'm so very deeply worried. In any case, what is the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court? It doesn't change the numbers in Parliament. Today, if there is a vote on the e-levy, the so-called majority cannot win. Today, if you take it to Parliament. So what have they done? You know, we will continue doing this and doing this and doing this to the extent that one day the patience of our people and our people in whose name we make decisions will run out. This is indefensible. Now I hear that the elections in Buem, the Attorney General is recommending that the elections in Buem should be rerun. What is this? So you can see that all the effort is to change the numbers in Parliament so that government can have its way. I am sick. I'm really sick. I'm really sick, you know. And since yesterday, I've been speaking to all kinds of people. And I've spoken to people who are leading members of the New Patriotic Party who feel disgusted by what has happened. Absolutely disgusted by what has happened. You understand? Absolutely disgusted. But the implications of this decision is also that today, deputy speakers are not to be treated in any way different from the way we treat members of parliament. You know, they are partisans in the House. They are partisans like any member of parliament. So when they are presiding, they are just sitting there like any other member of parliament. They have no privileges, they have no neutrality, they have nothing. Why do you introduce this level of chaos in parliament? And you see, the other thing is that the Supreme Court must understand that even though it has responsibility for interpreting the Constitution, it has no right, no authority to amend the Constitution. This whole decision is an attempt to amend the Constitution from the back door. And the Supreme Court has no such authority. I am completely worried by this move. And we'll all see the outcome very soon. It won't take long. All of us will see the outcome very soon. You understand? Of course, the outcome will not be a passage of the e-levy because that will never happen. Look, I've been watching all the surveys, the polls on e-levy. The most favorable poll for e-levy had 80% against, 82% against. Sometimes it goes as high as 98% against. So if you sit on the judiciary and you take decisions which clearly is intended to facilitate the passage of this unpopular bill, what are you doing? It is the lawyers themselves who tell us about the purposive interpretation of law. Purposive interpretation of law, what does it mean? That when you're interpreting the law, you ought to look at the impact on society. And this is what they have done. You've seen the comments by lawyers. I mean, Kokwaza and so on. You see the comments they've made. Everybody is disgusted by this decision. Went and did presidential election petition, came up with your decision. Everybody said, okay, you leave them, let them go ahead and so on. Now, this is the extent that you've gone. I'm disgusted by it. I'm a citizen of Ghana. The ruling of the Supreme Court is in my name, or supposed to be in my name. But I say that this cannot, I take my name out of this decision. This decision was not made on my behalf. It's so scandalous, it could not have been made on my behalf.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pratt. Wanted to ask something?
Yeah, so clearly it comes back to the point where I explained that by mere literal rules of interpretation, you are likely to rightly arrive at such. However, it creates that administrative conflict. So, for example, a good situation is, it means that if the speaker is not there and the deputy sits, he should be treated with a pinch of salt, because whatever he says now takes the direction of partisanship. So he is not assuming the uniform and the powers. He's not clothed with those powers of neutrality by the speaker himself. So on the one side, it explains the situation. On the other hand, it creates a bigger conflict for us, depending on the structure of, parliament. So a review might not yield any difference, given that it's the same market we'll be buying from. However, I think that it grants a situation where we are invited to an appreciation of the legal ramifications of the matter to its fullest effect.
Right. Briefly, Dr. Nimoy Thompson, he was a former Director General of the National Development Planning Commission. He has expressed worry over the Ghanaian cedi's free fall in value in recent times. Just a few minutes.
Are you looking at the time?
Yes, I've checked. I've checked.
And what does your time say?
It's I think it's 9:33. It's 9:30. Just a few minutes, and then we can go from here. So I want you to comment briefly and on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is no news and not surprising to anybody. It's just a major indictment on none other than the head of the economic management team, Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia, who was at a point touted as the only persona with all the economic wisdom, the economic doyen. And so if today he was the one trusted most by the president, and this is the disappointment we are seeing with the free fall of the cedi, the questions many want to ask is, what is happening? Has his economic management team turned into an economics management team? And the fact that Dr. Bawumia has remained very mute and silent on this, I am sorry, pardon my language, but it has constituted his definition as a true worthless individual within the regime. And he now just looks like a senior presidential staffer at the presidency, doing the job of what staffers are doing. He has now rather made himself an IT expert over things that are supposed to be catered for by department heads, etc., when the cedi is at the free fall. As we speak currently, there's no solution in sight because the whole regime is confused and cannot tell what solution they have. And that is very worrying. I mean, the cedi, the pound broke the 8 long ago. The euro did same. The dollar is close to breaking the 8. Petrol price is doing same. And I was even told that somewhere next week, it is most likely that the fuel at the pumps will hit about 10 cedis per liter. And that is very worrying. Right. So someone called me asking if we knew someone, and some of the stations have even begun hoarding because they feel it's also another opportunity for them to milk the system more. So it is very worrying that this has been a failure, an absolute failure of a regime when it comes to even the economy and the cedi's depreciation.
Right. Elvis, briefly.
Yeah, economics rhetorics is the problem with Africa. The situation in which we find ourselves is a bad situation. I mean, one does not need glass eyes to realize that we are in a terrible situation. You see, the problem we have as a nation is too much partisanship. That is the Ghanaian problem. Let he who speaks act. Governance is in action and not in rhetorics. The nature of the cedi today and its depreciation is so terrible that it affects businesses, it affects the very markets we all go to, it affects even bills, it affects every facet of our life. But transportation feeds as a primary factor of inflation, of primary goods out there. Can we not have a consensus? You see, knowledge, you are more knowledgeable when you create more space to say that, look, help me understand things. But he who knows it all is the biggest fool. Do you understand me? He who knows it all is the biggest fool. But that is the problem with Africa, and that is the problem with Ghana. We have a terrible situation. We do not need empathy. We do not need empathy on this. We need collaboration on this. We need consensus on this. We need rethinking on this. We need to draw pride on this. We need humility on this. Else the nonsense will continue. Whether party A or party B, this nonsense will continue.
Right, thank you so much. Let me wrap up with Mr. Pratt.
Well, this is a confirmation of the huge hole in the national economy. In fact, cumulatively since 1982, we have devalued our national currency by more than 30,000%. And everybody should be worried. I mean, things are not going well. We are sinking deeper and deeper into the hole. That's all.
Thank you so much. And before we go, let me read a couple of messages. It says, Ibrahim Boss, hi, good morning, Pan-African TV. I'm watching you live from Hillsborough, New Jersey. Gambo Sadiku says, good morning, bless. I love this platform. God bless you. Watching from Qatar. Julie Belinda Obri says, this government is confused and changing everything. Cannot wait to hear from Uncle Kwesi. Eric Nats, why must we continue to pay people to multiply our poverty? Edward Dugbaza says, the decision of the Supreme Court these days are very disappointing. I'm not a lawyer, but can easily predict the outcome of any judgment from them. This must be worrying. Ali Duinusa says, the Ghanaian president rushed to condemn Russia. Does that mean he's against the other African leaders? Jonas Jesse says, I think we should also take the vice president to court, since it's not an elected position, but yet he acts and takes decisions when the president is absent. Okay. JK says, the legs of our democracy is being tortured by this current government, and it's so worrying, and Ghanaians need to be careful with the direction the country is going. Okay. Obapa Mari says, bless, good morning. Please, they should allow us, the citizens, to vote on the e-levy, period. Okay. Suleiman Abdul Rahim says, the least said about the economist in this country, the better. If you cannot reduce the price of Gary, how can you manage the depreciation of the cedi by the dollar? Levi Ariel says, good morning, Pan-Africa. Bless, you don't read my message. I'm doing that now. Please, my contribution to your show is that if care is not taken, Supreme Court will bend this country. Okay. Delabdala says, Justice, all that I was saying is, if anyone has a chance, they should listen to okay, right. The final one says, good morning to you, and I am watching you live from Kumbungu. My greetings to okay. The act of our judges clearly shows that we are not practicing democracy anymore. Okay, thank you so much. That's all time will permit us for this morning's edition of the show. Unfortunately, we have to call time on this morning's program. Let me say thank you to Comrade Elikem Kotoko, as well as Comrade Pratt, and then Elvis Bota, who will join us in the studio for this morning's discussion. Thank you too for doing the watching. Thank you so much. We'll meet same time tomorrow. My name is Bless Alamaso. Bye-bye.